Hello, and welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzie Ostwalt, and this week we'll be focusing on religious life in America with one of the foremost Christian leaders in the country. Our guest is the Reverend Dr. William H. Willimon. Dr. Willimon is a professor at Duke Divinity School, the past bishop of the North Alabama Conference of the United Methodist Church, and the past dean of the Duke University Chapel, and he's author of over 70 books. Welcome, Dr. Willimon.
Thank you.
May I call you Will?
You sure may.
I appreciate you
I
taking.
can call you Ozzie.
Absolutely. I appreciate you taking your time out of your busy schedule and joining us today.
Thank you.
I don't know where to begin. You're a professor, you're bishop, you're dean, you're author, theologian, award-winning figure in American religion. How do you do it? How do you juggle all of these different tasks throughout your career?
I don't know how I do what I do, but I think I kind of know why, and that is I'm a Methodist preacher. That was kind of the one thing that I was sure about in my life, that God wanted me to do and that I felt called to do. And one thing I liked about being a Methodist pastor was the diversity of what you got to do.
Right.
You got to teach, you got to counsel, you got to preach, you got to pray and be with people in important moments in their lives. You got to study. And I kind of think of my life as I've been fortunate to get to do those things in some wonderful settings in a prominent way, and that's been great. But I think that I'm doing what pastors do.
So if I were to ask you to identify your vocation, it would be preacher, not bishop.
Yeah, I'm a preacher. I went through some anguish in college, sort of admitting to myself, gee, I really feel called to be a pastor and go to seminary, and nobody in my family had ever done anything like that. And I remember that kind of anguish of, oh, I'm not going to law school. Oh, gee, I'm not going to graduate school. I'm going into seminary and ministry. And I think once I decided on that, that really felt right. And so that's who I think I am.
I would say you followed the right path.
Well, good. I don't know that I'm the best representative, but it's been a happy life.
Well, you've been called one of the most influential preachers in America. You're the one of the top 2 most widely read theologians in Protestant Christianity. So I would say you've made quite an impact throughout your career.
I'm grateful.
I'm curious what the life of the dean of the chapel at Duke University must be like. It's just a remarkable cathedral to start with.
It is. Mr. Duke, when he gave his indenture to Duke back in the 20s, and Duke was built in the 30s, the first thing he said, he says, I want a great towering church in the center of the campus to be a spiritual, moral influence on the students who come here. So right from the beginning, it was planned to be the kind of center of Duke. The image of Duke was that great big chapel, designed by America's first great African-American architect, Julian Abel. And that chapel is really today kind of alone as one of the most active university chapels in America. And it was such a privilege to be there. You're in the center of the campus. I remember when I was being hired by Terry Sanford, who was then the president of Duke. He said, I said to him, I really think of myself as a pastor, as a Methodist preacher. And he said, well, that's odd, because looking at your resume, you spent more time on a college campus than you have in a local Methodist church. And I said, oh, that's true. And but I loved it because I got to be a pastor. I got to be a preacher in that wonderful setting with wonderful music and all, but also got to mix it up with the students, and I love that part of the work, and the faculty.
I was going to ask you if you had much interaction with students while you were.
Yeah, I really did. I worked at it. One thing, when I was hired, Mr. Sanford told me, he said, by the way, you will be evaluated by how well you work with the students. I said, really? And he said, they're paying your salary with their tuition. And I love that part of the job. I think a lot of it was just selfish. I love what God does with people in those student years.
Mm-hmm.
I loved having a front row seat on that and pursuing them. I had a program I did for fraternities on male friendship, because that I would come to weasel my way into the fraternity section and get to meet with them. And two Duke presidents asked me, President Brody was the first, asked me to do a report on student life on weekends and after dark. So I moved into the dorm and went to parties and interviewed students, student groups, and wrote a report called "We Work Hard, We Play Hard," which was a kind of a slogan among Duke students.
Right.
And then Nan Cohan later asked me to do a follow-up report 10 years later. So those were great experiences to get to be with the students. And it's wonderful to see the Christian faith make its own way in the intellectual world. And one thing I enjoyed about this generation of students was that they, religion, faith, spirituality are issues they want in the mix.
Right.
And it was sometimes the university and the faculty, they were kind of squeamish to get into religious things. The students were delighted to talk about it, debate it, witness to it, and that made it fun.
Well, those years are transformative years, and it is a privilege, as you know, and as I know, to work with young people of that
Yeah,
age. Oh.
they were. I remember my college years. I went to Wofford College, but I remember those just golden years and of growth and expectation, and your life is on fast forward. And I remember someone saying, you know, should we really try to convert people to our faith? That seems kind of arrogant for us to convert people. And I said, it's a university. We're all in the conversion business.
Right.
I said, if you talk to people in women's studies, they're fanatics. They really think women's studies can change your life. And I said, I love that. And it's kind of like at the university, whether it's faith groups or it's an academic discipline, students kind of show up and say, hey, hit me.
Right.
Show me what you got. Yeah, make me a more interesting person than I would be if I had not been in paying this high tuition and coming here. And so I love being kind of faculty and feeling like, well, we're kind of all in the conversion business. And I used to say, I know students, I mean, if they're not born again a couple of times a semester, they want their tuition back.
Right.
And they love to kind of go into an experience, have a conversation, go to a class, attend a lecture, and walk out saying, wow, I'm a different person than I was before that. And I love that.
That is wonderful. It keeps us young, doesn't it? Or
it does.
Yeah.
It does.
Let me let's shift gears a little bit. You're the author of over 70 books, which boggles my mind. I don't know how anybody could be so productive, but you've done it. And what's that like? Do you remember every book you've written, and how would you characterize your work?
I can with some help, but again, I really think of myself as a preacher, and the first pitiful little church I served in Georgia, I had to preach 3 times a week, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and those weren't all sort of sermons, but I had to prepare. And so I think I just got in this habit of producing material. And I remember when I came up for my first review at Duke as a professor in the divinity school, W.D. Davies, the great Duke New Testament scholar, said to me, your work, admirable quantity and quality, but it's you're prolific. It's popular. You probably ought to watch that. You don't want to be overexposed. And I said, overexposed? Madonna's overexposed. I said, I'm a preacher. Can you imagine anyone saying to a preacher, be careful now preaching every Sunday this month because you don't want to be overexposed. So I think in my mind and in my heart, I think I'm writing like a preacher, and people want to publish my work, and I'm grateful. And I said, great, there it is. And then the fact that people want to read it, and that occasionally I'll get a note from someone saying, oh, I've always wondered about this, and I read your book. That's wonderful. As wonderful as when they stand at the door of the church afterwards and say,
Sure.
wow, that really, I've never understood that scripture till today. And so.
I think I read you've sold over 1 million copies of your books. And
Amazing.
That's amazing.
Speaking of students, the student asked me one time a question about my writing. I thought he asked me, why do you write so much? So I said to him, my father was incarcerated for bank fraud before I was born, and he served in federal penitentiary 3 years, and as soon as he got out, I was born 9 months later after he got out, and but then he left us after a couple of years, and I think I've always had this kind of nagging sense of illegitimacy, and I didn't grow up with a father and everything, and I had this kind of need to prove myself. And the student said, I meant, do you use note cards or do you go with an outline? I said, oh, I thought you said why. And he said, no, it was how.
How
do you write? And I said, I love students.
Well, do you use note? That's a wonderful story. Well, I wanted to ask you about one of your latest books, Fear of the Other. I thought maybe I was focusing on your latest book, but you're so prolific, you just churn them out before I can get them all read. But that book seems timely to me. I think published it last year.
Yeah, and I was kind of asked to do it by Abingdon, said we need a book out for General Conference and on this subject of fear and fear of others. And I opened the book, I dedicated it, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, I dedicated it to Ted Cruz, Donald Trump, and somebody else, Ben Carson. And I said, if it hadn't been for your xenophobia, I wouldn't have been asked to write this book. So I owe it all to you, fellow Christians. And it's a book about xenophobia. Xenophobia, as you know, is kind of a good New Testament word. The xenoi is the Greek word for foreigners, others, aliens. And xenophobia, after my book came out, xenophobia was declared the word of the year for that year by dictionary.com. So it was very much in the news, and I said that, you know, the fear of the other has always been with us, and yet in that particular, in the last presidential election, fear of the other was really leveraged into votes. And I felt there was a need for Christians to take a deep breath and try to think about fear of the other like Christians. And
your thesis pretty much is that the church must be welcoming to the other, and not do away with the fear, but to overcome the fear or work through the fear.
Jesus tells a parable about I was a stranger and you welcome me. Paul, in a couple places in his letters, says to churches, you ought to welcome one another as Christ welcomed you. And so for Christians, we see ourselves as the other, the enemies of God, and God in Jesus Christ graciously welcomed us. And that would be reason enough, but then that same Christ turns around and makes hospitality, welcome, receiving the other as a key part of his work.
I think that probably not too many people view themselves as the other. That's generally something we project on people who are different from us. That's
another, we talk about in the book, for instance, white people generally do not view ourselves as having a race. It's other people are African Americans or Asian Americans. We're just Americans. Well, that kind of thinking, and also after I wrote the book, I got a letter from a woman who said she read the book, and then she started prayerfully thinking about this, and she realized that she'd had family moved in down the street, and who were Muslim, and she said, "Gosh, I didn't welcome them to the neighborhood. I welcomed everybody else in the neighborhood." So she baked a pie, and she went down the street and knocked on the door, and she could hear something behind the door of the house. So she knocked on the door again, and a woman peeked out. She said, "Hello, I'm your neighbor. I'm just bringing you a welcome to the neighborhood gift." And said the door opened, but it was a woman. And I think the woman was maybe had been from Pakistan originally. And the woman stood there, and she said, "Welcome to the neighborhood. I'm giving this pie and all." And she said the woman just broke down in tears, and she said, "You live on this street?" And said, "Yes." Said, "Well, we knew that you didn't want us here, and that people didn't want us moving here." And said, I've just been terrified. I don't go out of the house unless my husband is with me." And the woman giving the pie said, "You know, that was the saddest, worst thing I'd ever heard said about my neighborhood." But she said, in that instant, I realized, wait a minute. I'm the one that's the one being feared. I am the other.
Right.
And so that experience, I think, is a holy and wonderful experience to have. Probably me being a member of a kind of majority in most settings I'm in, I need to experience more myself as the other, that other people wonder about.
So your book, when you talk about the other, I mean, you talk about, this is relevant for issues concerning race, gender, sexual orientation, religious faith. I mean, these are all categories by which we tend to, the way we see other people, and think of them as other than ourselves. So this is really kind of an all-encompassing challenge, if you will.
And it does, we may have different others whom we fear, but it is a deep, innate, deep within us from millions of years of evolution, that sense that we hear a rustle in the bushes, and all immediately, without being told to do so, the brain starts releasing all of these chemicals into our bodies that protect us, and then we can flee, or we can stand and fight, or whatever. In the book, I noticed this is so natural. This is so normal.
The fear.
The fear.
The fear.
But one bad thing is that when your brain starts doing that, that the fear reflex, they call it, your rational capacity goes down, your ability to make good decisions goes down, everything takes over, fear takes over everything else and rules out your reason, you know. And that's a perfectly natural, adaptive, protective mechanism. I say, though, that as Christians, there's like adultery comes naturally to me. I mean, this is, you know, monogamy is not what I'm built for, through millions of years of evolution and continuing the race. Well, but here I've overcome that, and I say it's a Christian claim that Jesus Christ enables us to embrace the other, to move toward rather than away from the feared other, that Jesus Christ can actually do that. So I think it therefore behooves us Christians in the present moment to say, I'm sorry, you know, as a Christian, I'm under a mandate from Christ to move toward, to embrace, to welcome, to be hospitable to the other. So that's different.
So even though the fear is innate, is it also a sin to fear the other, or a failure of sort that needs redemption?
You know, I'm a Methodist, and we don't talk that much about sin since we've mostly overcome that. No, I think it's a good. Yes, I think it's a sin because Jesus Christ, in a sense, commands us, and yet in our xenophobia, we disobey Christ and move in another direction. But the Christian faith specializes in overcoming all kinds of sins. And a big thing is sin is not only what I do, but here's Jesus talking about lust of the heart.
Right.
You've heard you shouldn't look at somebody you shouldn't commit adultery. I tell you, if you just look at somebody lustfully, it's as good as adultery. Well, he really raises the bar on this, and I think that's, yeah. And again, as Christians, we believe Jesus Christ can make us better than we were born and bred to be.
Well, we've got short time left, but I want to ask you sort of a practical question, because this program does look at how religion impacts life. I know in your book you outlined some suggestions about how churches and Christians might be better at overcoming this fear of the other and reaching out. Could maybe you give us just one practical suggestion here as we wind down?
Well, I think we can, in our daily lives, in our work, we can ask ourselves, who do I work with in my office, in my classroom, at the factory, that are others that I really have never had a conversation with. I've never asked them, tell me about your family. How'd you get here? Let me tell you how I got here. We can do that. I remember a pastor saying that he had preached a sermon on racial justice and about races coming together and all. And after the sermon, he had a discussion, and he expected a lot of pushback from the congregation. He didn't get that. But one of the congregation members said, Joe, do you have an African-American friend? Somebody that you see like in your home or once a week, you know? And he said, well, I've got, sort of friends. And so the pastors looked out at the group of lay people and said, how many of you have daily, rather significant contact with a person from another race? 2/3 of the hands went up in the room. The church member said, the layperson said, Joe, it seems like you're the main one that's got a problem with making connections. And he said, what a resource to say, hey, let your faith work there. And so.
Well, Dr. Williman, you're a fascinating person.
Hey, and thank you for your work here at App State. And you've sent some great students to Duke Divinity School, but also in your classes and your witness here at this grand state university.
I appreciate it.
Great.
We're proud of what we do here. We're proud to be associated with you, and I thank you for spending time with us today.
Great.
And thank you for joining us on Religion and Life, brought to you by App TV. I thank my guest, Dr. William Williman, for stopping by this week. And on the next episode of Religion and Life, we'll be joined by representatives from Carey's Home for Women. We hope you will join us then. Until next time, this is Ozzie Ostwalt.